The coach didn't even flinch when he said it. Let's see if the black kid can keep up this time. The entire stadium laughed. Cameras rolling as Jason stepped to the line, alone, his shredded sneakers taped together. On the other side, Brady, the school's golden boy, stretched with a smirk, surrounded by cheers. But just as the gun was about to fire, someone in the crowd whispered, "Make him fall." Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The rhythmic pounding of cleats echoed across the field like a tribal drum line. Predictable, sharp, in sync. Coach Danley's whistle sliced through the late afternoon air, a sharp screech that halted motion mid-stride. Athletes gasped, sweat-drenched and panting, as they hunched forward with hands on their knees, eyes on the clipboard he always clutched like scripture. This was no ordinary practice. Not with the district championships looming. Not with Brady Stetson, undefeated, revered, the living trophy of Fairview High, jogging at the front like a lion in its kingdom. No one dared challenge Brady. You didn't run against Brady. You ran behind him. Except today something felt different. There was a tension in the air that hadn't been there yesterday, or the day before. The sun seemed to hang heavier, and conversations in the locker room had been cut short the moment one specific name came up. Jason Carter, the new transfer. Tall, lean, dark-skinned, and quiet. He hadn't spoken more than 20 words since he arrived 2 weeks ago. But his warm-ups had caught eyes, those long, deliberate strides, the way his feet barely seemed to touch the ground. Word traveled fast. A few had seen him training solo at dawn. A few had whispered that he was fast, maybe too fast. But Fairview had never been a place for maybes. Not when it came from boys like him. Coach Danley adjusted his cap and scanned the field, his eyes resting on Jason, who stood apart from the rest of the group, tying his shoe in silence. His hoodie still clung to his frame even in the heat, as if he knew better than to reveal too much too soon. That's when the words came. Not loud, but sharp enough to cut every sound on the field. "Let's see if the new boy can outrun our champ," Coach Danley said, letting the statement hang like a storm cloud. That should be entertaining. The field went dead silent. No whistles, no shouts, not even the birds dared interrupt. A few of the boys turned their heads slowly toward Jason, unsure whether to laugh, gasp, or stay silent. Jason looked up slowly, his brows narrowed, not in confusion, but in clarity. He knew exactly what had just happened. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't encouragement. It was a dare dipped in mockery. Brady chuckled. One of those effortless, smug laughs that sounded like it had been rehearsed. "Coach, you serious?" he said loud enough for everyone to hear, still jogging in place with effortless ease. "Come on. Let's not embarrass the kid."
There it was.
The laughter. Quiet at first, then swelling, hesitant at the edges, but emboldened by the coach's silence. The message was clear. This wasn't about testing talent. It was about putting Jason in his place. Coach Danley didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just wrote something on his clipboard and blew the whistle again. "Line up." Jason stood still. He didn't flinch either. For a brief second, every single pair of eyes on that field watched him. Expecting what? A protest? A glare? A walk-off? But Jason didn't give them what they wanted. He reached up calmly, pulled off the hoodie, revealing a plain gray t-shirt soaked in quiet confidence. He stepped forward and moved to the line. Standing at lane, Brady strutted into lane 3, shaking his arms out dramatically like he was on national television. The smirk on his face looked permanent, unbothered, almost bored. Coach raised the stopwatch. "Just 200, he said flatly. "One sprint. Let's go." The hush that fell over the track was unnatural. Even the teammates on the sidelines weren't sure whether to cheer or stay out of it. This wasn't a race. This was a message being carved in daylight. Coach's voice pierced the quiet. "Ready?" Jason bent slightly, eyes forward, set. Brady's smirk turned razor thin. The whistle screamed. Brady exploded forward with the kind of cocky aggression you'd expect from a favorite. He was fast in a way most people weren't. Years of training, awards and media attention had made him a machine. But Jason didn't explode. He glided. He didn't push through the track. He floated across it. At first he trailed by half a stride like he was observing, measuring. His arms swung low, relaxed. His breath never hitched. At the halfway mark, something changed. Jason leaned slightly, and with a burst so quiet and surgical it didn't register right away, he pulled even. Brady noticed. And suddenly, the smirk was gone. The last 50 meters turned surreal. Two bodies in perfect sync, like mirror images, except one was being cheered and the other was being watched with dread. Every step closer to the finish line was a threat. Jason didn't surge. He didn't showboat. He just ran through a hair ahead, silent, effortless, as if gravity had tilted in his favor. Coach Danley clicked the stopwatch. No reaction, no praise. He just muttered something under his breath and walked away. The team stood still. There were no cheers, no claps, just silence. The kind of silence that follows a seismic shift. Jason turned, walked back to his hoodie, and put it back on, like nothing happened. Brady stood frozen at the finish line, chest heaving, disbelief etched across his face. But the moment that truly shattered the silence wasn't Jason's win. It was the eye contact. As Coach Danley passed behind them, eyes scanning his clipboard, Jason looked up, not at the coach but at Brady, calm, steady, as if to say, I didn't just win, I accepted your challenge, and I'm still here. Brady looked back, jaw tight. The silence between them said what the crowd couldn't. This wasn't over. This had just begun. As Coach Danley disappeared into the locker room, Brady stayed planted on the track, staring after Jason, but his hand clenched tightly around something unseen. A plan was already forming, and next time it wouldn't be about running. The moment Jason stepped off the track and into the quiet hallway behind the field, the air felt heavier, as if the world had shifted on its axis, and he was the only one who could sense the imbalance. What had begun as a humiliating dare, tossed carelessly by a coach who never expected to be challenged, was now spreading through the school with the speed of wildfire. The whispers started before he even reached the locker room, soft, hurried, drenched in disbelief. It wasn't admiration they carried, it was discomfort, the uneasy realization that someone they were conditioned to underestimate had just fractured a narrative that had been protected for years. Jason didn't need to hear the exact words to understand their meaning. The stares said enough, lingering not with curiosity, but with a simmering resentment, wrapped in disbelief, as if he had committed an unspoken offense merely by refusing to fail. Inside the locker room, the atmosphere thickened further, the rhythmic clatter of metal lockers closing, the hum of showers, and the dull echo of footsteps, all blended into a cold backdrop. Nothing in the room moved with its usual ease. Some boys kept their heads lowered, pretending to organize their gear. Others peeked at him through mirrors as though observing a creature they weren't sure belonged in their space. Brady stood near the far bench, still catching his breath, surrounded by teammates who hovered close enough to form a small orbit around him, yet far enough to avoid acknowledging what had truly happened. Their silence carried an accusation directed not at themselves, but at Jason, an unspoken insistence that he had crossed a line never meant for him. Jason placed his bag on the floor, keeping his expression neutral, despite the prickle behind his ribs. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel proud. He felt targeted. The moment he lowered himself onto the bench, he sensed a wave of tension roll through the room. It wasn't about him being fast. It was about him being fast, in a place that wasn't designed to let him shine. The school prided itself on tradition, on legacy, on predictability. Brady was the poster boy of all three. Jason was the disruption, uninvited, unfamiliar, and in their eyes, undeserving. What struck him most was the coach's absence. Coach Danley had slipped out of the room so quietly after the sprint that it almost looked intentional, as if he had engineered the moment and then abandoned it to unfold without taking responsibility. The rest of the team carried the weight of his silence, interpreting it as permission to treat Jason's performance not as a breakthrough but as a threat. The entire room felt like a place suddenly too small to hold him, yet too large for him to belong. The shift continued into the hallways after practice. By the time Jason walked toward the school exit, the news had already spread far beyond the track team. Students leaned against lockers with wide eyes, some pretending to scroll their phones while stealing glances at him, others murmuring behind cupped hands. The moment he passed, conversations fell quiet, followed by a palpable aftershock of tension. It was as though they were collectively disappointed that he had disrupted a familiar hierarchy, and now they were waiting, almost eager for the natural order to reassert itself. Jason felt the pressure most intensely during his walk home. The sun had dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, and each shadow felt like a reminder of the expectations now pressing against him from every direction. It wasn't just a race anymore, it had turned into a performance everyone demanded he fail. Failure would restore comfort for them. Success would isolate him even further. The weight of that truth settled onto his shoulders, with a heaviness that felt almost physical. At home, he entered quietly, avoiding the living room where the television glowed with its usual noise. He placed his backpack on the floor of his room, and sat at the edge of the bed, feeling the faint throb in his legs from the earlier sprint. The ache wasn't painful, it was grounding. It reminded him that he had earned every inch he'd gained on the track. But even that truth didn't shield him from the unease creeping through his chest. For the first time since arriving at Fairview, he wasn't being ignored. He was being watched, expected, dissected, and not one person rooting for him was willing to admit it in public. The unexpected twist came when he opened his school app. A thread had appeared on the student feed, a private forum most used to gossip, complain about teachers, or promote events. The top post wasn't text, it was a slow-motion clip of his sprint against Brady, captured from the bleachers by someone he hadn't even noticed. The camera zoomed in on the moment he passed Brady by a fraction of an inch. The comments flooded beneath it, a river of discontent disguised as casual observation. Some questioned whether he had cheated, insisting his form looked too unnatural. Others insisted he must have peaked early and wouldn't last in the real race. A few hid their condescension behind polite phrases, pretending to admire his speed while clearly rooting for him to collapse under pressure. Only one comment, buried between dozens, stated plainly that he deserved a fair chance. The comment had no light. Jason stared at the screen, breathing slowly as the narrative closed in around him. They weren't afraid he might lose. They were afraid he might win. The realization didn't empower him. It stung. He had never asked for a title, a spotlight, or a rivalry. All he had wanted was a place to run, a place to feel like he was allowed to chase something bigger than the assumptions attached to his skin. Night crept in without him noticing. Hours slipped away as he refreshed the page compulsively, each new comment carving another mark into him. By midnight, the thread had multiplied, with students creating predictions, mock posters, and even digital countdowns. The race date had become a spectacle, and he had become their entertainment. Fairview had never felt like home. Now it felt like a coliseum. The final blow came when he checked a public student-run account known for harsh anonymous commentary. At the top of the page, a new post glowed like a warning flare. It was a screenshot of him taken during warm-ups, sweat running down the side of his face. The caption beneath it read, "He won't even finish the race." Jason felt something tighten in his chest. Not defeat, not fear, but a slow-burning resolve forged from everything he had absorbed since stepping into Fairview. He locked his phone screen, the glow fading into darkness. The silence of his room deepened, punctuated only by the faint hum of the street lamps outside. He didn't lie down. He didn't try to sleep. Instead, he glanced at the clock, 3:07 a.m., and rose to his feet. His sneakers were waiting near the door, laces curled like patient hands. Without hesitation, he reached down, lifted them gently, and began tying them with a precision that steadied his pulse. When he stepped outside into the cold darkness, the street was empty, except for a shadow standing at the far end of the block, watching him as if expecting this moment. Jason ran through the dark like it owed him something. The concrete was slick from a night rain that had come and gone like a warning. Streetlights flickered overhead, casting golden streaks along the sidewalk. His breath came in steady bursts, not labored, not panicked, controlled. This wasn't just a workout, it was a reckoning. With each stride, he chased something invisible but necessary. A place to belong, a silence he could outrun, a version of himself they hadn't already decided on. His body moved like he had done this all his life. Like cities had changed, schools had blurred, coaches had ignored, and still his legs remembered. But here, at Fairview, it wasn't just his speed that unsettled people. It was his silence. He never gave them a reaction to feed off. And that, more than anything, made them uneasy. No one knew much about Jason because he made sure they didn't. His transfer file had been thin, just enough to satisfy administration. A GPA that raised no red flags. An emergency contact listed as a great aunt, with a disconnected number. No photos on social media. No middle school trophies. No stories of him growing up in the town next door. Just a boy who showed up in September with a backpack, a hoodie, and eyes that had seen too much to blink at their stares. What no one knew, what no one cared enough to ask, was that Jason had moved 5 times in the last 3 years. Each move was a restart disguised as relocation. From a rusted-out district in New Jersey, to an overcrowded charter in Atlanta, then a rural town in Indiana, where he was the only black kid in the entire school. Each time, the walls looked different, but the stares stayed the same. Some were hostile. Most were simply dismissive. They saw his skin before they saw his stride. In his old schools, he ran because it gave him control. Not trophies, not scholarships, just control over how he breathed, how far he pushed, how quiet the world got when he moved faster than it could box him in. At Fairview, though, control had become currency. Every move he made was a risk of being watched too closely, or not at all. The moment he outran Brady Stetson, he'd stopped being invisible. And in this town, visibility was dangerous when you weren't wrapped in their idea of pride. Jason knew what they saw. A fast kid from somewhere else, without a legacy, trying to claim a crown that wasn't designed for him. They didn't fear he'd fail. They feared what would happen if he didn't. His feet pounded through the park, the sound lost in the hush of wet leaves and distant traffic. It was the only place he could breathe freely now. After midnight under broken lamps, with only the occasional car passing by, he didn't wear earbuds. He didn't need music. The beat lived in his body now. He'd internalized every insult, every snub, every accidental shoulder bump in the hallway. He carried them with him like a second heart. He hit the far end of the path and slowed, bending forward with hands on knees. Rain clung to his shirt, dripping from his collarbone. The cold bit into his skin, but he welcomed it. Pain was proof of effort. Effort was proof of purpose. There had been no coaches at his past schools willing to give him a shot. One had told him outright he wasn't a system fit. Another put him in long distance as a joke, knowing full well the boy trained for sprints. They wanted him tired. They wanted him average. But his speed was rebellion. Every inch he gained on a track was a refusal to stay small. He stood again, adjusted his hood, and prepared to start another set. But something shifted in the air. That slight, unmistakable weight of being watched. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. But Jason had learned to trust instincts others ignored. Across the field, where the shadows thickened near the trees, a figure stood under a bent streetlight. The man didn't speak, didn't move, just watched. Jason didn't stop. He ran again, pretending not to notice. His strides lengthened, but his pulse sharpened, not from fear but from calculation. He'd been followed before. Back in Georgia, a white neighbor once tailed him around the block during a jog, phone in hand, whispering to 911 while accusing him of casing houses. He remembered the tone, the fake concern, the way the police never apologized. But this was different. Jason rounded the loop again, muscles warm now, heartbeat leveled. When he passed the spot again, the man was still there. But this time, something had changed. A glow. A phone screen. Raised. Recording. Jason didn't stop, didn't look directly. But the message was clear. His private space wasn't private anymore. Even in the rain, even in darkness, even without a crowd, someone had come to collect a moment. Why? He finished his loop and slowed his pace, heading toward the path that led back to the street. The man remained, unmoving, as if studying something rare. There was no smile, no greeting, just observation. Jason's mind raced. Was he from the school? Media? A scout? Or worse, was this another trap to twist his image into something they could control? A memory flashed. His mother's voice years ago, firm and steady before her job transferred and they had to move again. Don't give them a reason. They'll make one. He disappeared down the sidewalk, footsteps fading. Back home, he stripped out of his wet clothes and placed his shoes by the door, the night's tension still buzzing under his skin. Something was happening, shifting beneath the surface. The town was watching. The race was looming. But now someone outside the usual circle had seen him. Someone with a phone. Someone with intentions, unknown. And whatever that man had recorded, it was no longer just his to keep. The next morning, a grainy video clip is uploaded anonymously to the school's community page. Silent, shaky, but unmistakable. Jason, sprinting alone in the rain. The caption reads, "Fairview's fastest mistake." The walls of Fairview High were polished, lined with banners and trophies, a gallery of excellence meant to showcase tradition. But tradition, at its root, was selective. Behind the sheen of pride and performance, there lived a quieter truth, one that festered behind locked staff doors, closed locker rooms, and empty stairwells. It wasn't spoken loudly, but it pulsed with quiet cruelty. Jason Carter had cracked something they hadn't planned to fix. Out in the open, the school smiled at him, administrators nodding with forced encouragement, teachers complimenting his potential in tones too practiced to feel sincere. But when those same faces were no longer forced to perform, their words changed shape, and in private, they whispered with less restraint. It began subtly, comments tossed like lint behind closed doors. During a staff meeting, a counselor offhandedly remarked that Jason was quick-footed. Sure, but probably lacks the mental endurance for pressure. Another teacher, tapping her nails against a coffee mug, leaned in to murmur that she'd had students like him before. Bright at first, but always distracted by attitude. The language was coded, careful, the kind that protected its speakers from accusations, while delivering the same exclusion it always had. No one needed to say the word race. It hung in the air anyway. The locker room, once just a space for changing and idle chatter, had become a theater of tension. Brady's corner of the room was louder now, filled with laughter that didn't quite reach the eyes of those pretending to enjoy it. Teammates joined in, not out of loyalty, but because aligning with Brady meant safety. His voice carried, and so did his approval. Jason's bench, by contrast, remained quiet. Not by choice, but by design. The space around him had grown tighter without anyone saying so. His belongings had been accidentally moved more than once. His name on the roster board was left smudged after each update. Water bottles went missing, replaced with silence when he asked. No one confronted him directly. That would be too obvious. But everything about the room said, "You're not one of us." Even the assistant coach, Andre Whitman, noticed the shift. A former athlete himself, and one of the few black staff members at Fairview, Whitman had never been given much room to lead. He handed out cones, watched drills, gave advice when asked, but Danley made it clear who ran the program. Still, Whitman watched Jason carefully, not out of suspicion, but out of recognition. He'd seen that posture before. The silent scanning of exits, the forced stillness in rooms where you weren't invited to speak. It wasn't fear, it was strategy. What unsettled Whitman most wasn't the players. It was the adults. In the coach's office one afternoon, Whitman overheard Danley and another assistant sharing laughs over practice footage. The conversation drifted from metrics to mockery, with disturbing ease. Danley had paused the tape, showing Jason's final sprint. He didn't praise the form, he didn't mention the clean acceleration, or the footwork. Instead, he leaned back and said that Jason was raw, followed by a chuckle and a dismissive wave of his hand. The term landed like a slap. Raw wasn't a compliment, it was a dismissal, a way to say undisciplined, unpolished, not our kind. Later that day, a group of seniors huddled near the weight room, murmuring about the upcoming meet. One of them, a starter named Colby with a legacy jersey his father once wore, joked about how they always come in hot, but burn out fast. No names were mentioned, but the subtext was loud enough to echo. Whitman tried once to raise it, casually, with Danley. He framed it carefully, mentioning the shift in team dynamics, the unspoken tension. Danley didn't look up from his clipboard. He just muttered that competition always stirred emotions, and to let the boys handle it on the track. Translation: this wasn't a problem unless Jason won again. Outside of athletics, the whispers found new hosts. A science teacher noted in the lounge that Jason had missed a lab session. Never mind that it had been due to a scheduling mix-up the front office never corrected. A secretary made a face when saying his name while organizing forms. The counselor filed a report noting his increased isolation, yet never once asked him how he was doing. And still, Jason showed up. He trained, he ran. He didn't respond to the cold shoulders, the backhanded remarks, the suspicious glances. He moved through the school like someone carrying glass, quietly, carefully, not because he was fragile, but because he knew others wanted to see him crack. The unexpected twist came midweek, when a substitute teacher took over Jason's history class. She was young, fresh out of grad school, unaware of the school's social undercurrents. She played the now viral track video by mistake, thinking it was part of a school spirit montage someone had linked in the shared drive. Laughter erupted in the class, not at Jason's performance, but at the caption, "Fairview's fastest mistake." The video had been cut cruelly, showing his sprint in slow motion, but ending with Brady's frustrated expression, framed to suggest pity, not defeat. It was mockery disguised as montage. Jason sat in the back, unmoved, his face unreadable. The substitute, confused and apologetic, fumbled to stop the video, but the damage had already been done. Laughter carried into the hall after the bell. That day, students didn't avoid looking at him. They stared directly, as if daring him to respond. But he didn't. Not yet. Later that afternoon, Whitman passed by the teacher's lounge, just as a conversation caught his ear. He paused outside the door, hearing voices he recognized. Older, familiar, smug. Inside, a group of senior players stood around the vending machine, talking freely, as if their words were harmless. One of them, clearly Brady's friend, leaned casually against the counter, and said with quiet certainty that Jason wouldn't last. That he wasn't built for this pressure, that kids like him always break before race day. The others nodded, laughed, agreed. What none of them realized was that Whitman had heard everything. He didn't move, didn't interrupt. He simply stood outside that door, jaw tight, pulse steady, knowing full well what it meant, and how quickly words like that could become prophecy if left unchecked. That night, Whitman pulled out an old notebook from his desk drawer, the one he hadn't touched in years, and started writing names, not just players, staff, observations, timelines, because if no one else was keeping track, he would. And someone somewhere was going to need proof. He trained in the quiet corners of the world, the places no one thought to look, or wanted to. Parks long after dusk, back alleys behind the school where the concrete was cracked and uneven, empty fields lit only by the weak flicker of a dying lamppost. These weren't places of prestige. There were no cheering crowds, no stopwatch in hand, no coach shouting split times, just him, the cold air, and the sound of his breath colliding with silence. Each run began like a confession, each step peeling away the layers of doubt that had been thrown at him during the day. Jason didn't train to prove anyone wrong. He trained because it was the only place where he could breathe without translation, where his pain didn't need a label, and his effort didn't require permission. The track at school had rules, politics, favoritism, but the streets didn't care. The streets didn't ask who his father was, or where his transcripts came from, or whether the coach approved. The asphalt only asked for one thing: keep going. No one offered to help him. No teammate ran beside him. Coach Danley certainly didn't offer additional drills. And even Whitman, as observant as he was, kept his distance for reasons Jason didn't understand yet. It didn't matter. Jason had learned not to wait for encouragement. Encouragement was a privilege that came after you'd already been accepted. He wasn't there yet. He might never. Still, he ran, through gravel and broken glass, across sidewalks tilted from years of frost, down quiet residential streets where porch lights flicked on when they saw him pass. Some of the homes had curtains that shifted just slightly as he moved by, eyes behind them, silent judgments. The late-night runner with dark skin and a hood pulled tight, never mind the sneakers worn from training or the school logo on his sleeve. To them, he wasn't training. He was trespassing. His routine became sharper, more focused. He trained with a discipline that bordered on obsession. Each night was measured. Acceleration drills between telephone poles, pacing his strides by the passing of distant traffic lights. He recorded his splits on his phone, analyzing his form through blurred shadows caught on broken security mirrors at the edge of gas stations. No feedback, no validation, only instinct and necessity. The doubt, though, always present. It clung to him like a second skin. Not the kind that came from insecurity, but the kind others projected onto him, day after day. The side glances in the hallway. The way Brady had started referring to him indirectly in post-practice conversations, calling him track tryout with a laugh that wasn't meant to be funny. The way his locker had started to feel like it was shrinking, the space around it slowly tightening as if the air itself didn't want him there. But worse than all of it was the silence of authority. The way the adults who saw what was happening chose not to see it. That silence echoed louder than any insult. It told him that no matter how hard he trained, how cleanly he ran, or how quiet he kept himself, he would never be the right kind of fast. Not here. And yet, each night he ran anyway. The air grew colder as winter crept in, but he welcomed it. Pain was honest. At least the cold didn't lie to him. He ran with numb fingers and breath like smoke, circling the same routes with machine-like focus. His legs ached by the third lap, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. If he let himself rest too long, the voices would catch up, their words, their doubts, their expectations, all climbing onto his back like weights he hadn't agreed to carry. He didn't tell anyone what his body felt like after these runs. The pulled tightness in his calves, the burning in his lungs, the stiffness in his spine that made sitting in first period feel like he'd been hit by a truck. He wore it all like armor, quiet invisible armor. Some nights he'd pass by the school's track on his way back home. The gates were locked, the field dark, but he'd stand there anyway, gripping the chain link, and staring out over the lanes, the perfectly painted curves, the luxury of a surface designed for speed. He didn't belong on that track yet, not officially. That space had rules, spoken and unspoken. He had violated one by being faster than their golden boy. That kind of truth was dangerous in a town that didn't want its myths challenged. Then came the unexpected twist. One evening after a longer run than usual, Jason passed through the back entrance of a church parking lot. He often used it as a shortcut to avoid the main road. A habit born from a childhood lesson he could never unlearn. Stay visible enough not to be suspicious, but invisible enough not to be a threat. As he crossed under the floodlight, a car idling in the lot suddenly blinked its headlights twice. He stopped, just briefly, heart spiking. The driver didn't exit. The windows were tinted, the license plate blurred with road grime. It wasn't someone he knew, but as he moved past the vehicle, something changed. The passenger window rolled down halfway, just enough for a hand to extend and drop something on the asphalt. A folded paper. No words were spoken. The car drove off seconds later, disappearing into the night. Jason waited until the sound of the engine vanished before picking up the paper. It wasn't heavy, it wasn't threatening, but when he unfolded it under the lamplight, his hands stilled. Inside was a photo, a printed screenshot from the video that had circulated earlier. Him sprinting in the rain, but this version had no caption, just a single line typed beneath the image, like a warning or a prophecy. Run, but don't forget, they want you to. He stood there staring at the words, unable to breathe for a moment. Who had left it? Why? Was it a threat? A warning? A reminder? For the first time in weeks, he felt unsure not just of himself, but of the very ground he ran on. Later that night, when he finally reached home, shoes soaked, legs trembling, he expected the usual routine: drop his bag, shower, sleep. But as he approached the front door, something stopped him cold. Spray paint, thick, red, fresh. A single word smeared across the door in rushed, uneven strokes. Quit. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't coded. It was direct, loud, and personal. Jason stared at it for several seconds, unmoving, not shocked, not broken, just silent. Because now, it wasn't just about a race. It was about survival. Inside the house, his aunt was already scrubbing at the door with tears in her eyes. But taped to the mailbox was another note, this one smaller, handwritten, and trembling in ink. You win, and we all lose. If Jason was the outsider clawing through shadows, Brady Stetson was the son the town worshipped without question. His name wasn't just known, it was spoken with reverence. Coaches from neighboring schools referred to him like a legend in motion. Teachers framed his essays on the wall. Community newsletters ran photos of his races like hometown war victories. His victories weren't measured in seconds. They were stories, parables that shaped the town's identity. Brady was more than fast. He was curated. Born into the right family with the right last name. He was raised on legacy. His father had set records on that very same track 2 decades earlier. His uncle sat on the school board. His mother chaired the booster club and had keys to facilities even teachers didn't have access to. Brady didn't train. He was trained, handled, elevated. From personalized nutrition plans to private coaching sessions, his pathway to excellence had been paved long before he laced his first cleats. In the halls of Fairview High, Brady didn't walk. He moved with the comfort of ownership. Teachers paused lessons to congratulate him on his latest time. His peers high-fived him not because they liked him, but because it was easier than not to. Even students who barely followed sports knew his stats. He had never been a peer. He was an institution. But under the image was something sharper. Brady had learned long ago that being liked was optional, but being untouchable was essential. His confidence wasn't born from skill, it was built on insulation. The school didn't just protect him, it depended on him. When he won, they all won. When he ran, the town watched. And when someone threatened that narrative, even by a fraction of a second, the reaction wasn't fear, it was offense. That's why Jason's sprint wasn't seen as a competition. It was an intrusion. Brady hadn't taken the challenge seriously. Not at first. He had laughed when Coach Danley dared the new kid to run, laughed louder when his teammates hyped the joke. But when Jason crossed the finish line ahead of him, even just barely, Brady felt something he hadn't felt since middle school. A glitch. Not defeat. Just a fracture. Still, he played it cool. He brushed off the whispers, ignored the side eyes from teammates who weren't bold enough to say what they were thinking. He kept his posture straight, his smile sharp, and repeated the same line to everyone who brought it up. It was just a warm-up, over and over, like a charm against disbelief. But behind the scenes something in him twisted. At home, Brady's room was a monument to his legacy. Medals hung in perfect rows, framed newspaper clippings lined the walls. A custom-made race suit hung like armor on a rack beside his bed. And yet, since that practice, he couldn't stop replaying those last few meters in his mind. The moment Jason passed him, quiet, unbothered, not with aggression, not with arrogance, just precision, as if Brady wasn't the target at all. That insult cut deeper than any trash talk. And so, Brady went on the offensive, not on the track, but off it. He began showing up earlier to practices, not to improve, but to be seen improving. Posting clips on social media, carefully edited to show his times, sharing stories of his grind with captions that echoed resilience. The goal wasn't training, it was control. If people saw how seriously he was taking this, they'd interpret Jason's sprint as a fluke, an anomaly, something Brady was already correcting. But what truly shifted public perception came during a sit-down with a local sports blogger. It was supposed to be a short feature, a standard puff piece about the upcoming race, and Brady's goals. But Brady saw opportunity. He knew the town would read it. He knew the staff would share it. And he knew exactly what to say to tip the scales back in his favor. Halfway through the interview, he leaned back in his chair, flashing that perfect, effortless grin. The room was quiet. The recorder on the table blinked red. The blogger asked a final loaded question. So what do you think about the new kid? The transfer? Word is, he beat you in practice. Brady didn't hesitate. He laughed, a polished practice sound. And then he said it. I'll jog and still beat him. That quote spread faster than the footage of Jason's win. It was clipped, shared, reposted. Students echoed it in the halls. Teachers smiled when they quoted it. Even parents in the community chuckled as they read the article online. Because that sentence wasn't just about confidence, it was a re-establishment of hierarchy, a reminder that Brady wasn't nervous. He wasn't watching Jason, he wasn't threatened. He was cruising, but not everyone believed him. Whitman, watching from the sidelines, saw the micro-reactions. The way Brady had begun pushing drills harder, even when no one asked. The way he checked the stopwatches twice. The way he stared too long at Jason during warm-ups, jaw tight. Whitman knew the signs. Brady wasn't coasting, he was unraveling slowly, silently, but steadily. Because there was one thing legacy athletes feared more than losing: being forgotten. And Jason's silence was loud. Brady's teammates fell into step around him, repeating his confidence like scripture. But in their eyes, there was uncertainty. A few had seen Jason run, really run. And though they laughed at the quote, they didn't repeat it when Jason passed them in the hallway. There was a new kind of tension forming. The kind that fractures teams from the inside. But Brady? He doubled down. He posed for more photos, wore his branded gear louder, met with Coach Danley more often, casually suggesting tweaks to the training schedule. When questioned, he shrugged it off. Just optimizing. But the truth was simple. He wasn't preparing to run. He was preparing to reclaim. Then came the unexpected twist. 3 days after the blog post dropped, a different piece surfaced, anonymously posted on a private student page, but gaining traction fast. A photo from last year's championship win. Brady, holding the trophy high, but zoomed into the background. The face of a black student, blurred by motion, sweeping the track in a maintenance vest. The caption was brutal. Fairview's only tradition, same track, different roles. The post caught fire. Students debated it in whispers. Some dismissed it as inflammatory. Others began looking at Brady's wins with different eyes. Was it skill or system? Was Jason just a runner, or a threat to an image they'd been selling for too long? Brady saw it too. And for the first time, he didn't smile. That night, Brady received an unmarked envelope in his gym locker. Inside was a printed photo of Jason mid-sprint, taped to a mirror with a single sentence scrawled across it in red ink. He's not running against you. He's running through you. Coach Danley had never liked surprises. He built his career by making sure none occurred. Every athlete, every meet, every statistic was a calculated step in a system he had mastered, one that favored predictability over potential. In Fairview, he wasn't just a coach, he was the architect of legacy. 2 state titles, 5 conference wins, and a reputation that reached beyond school walls. Parents sent their sons to Fairview to be built into winners, and Danley made sure the mold remained untouched. His version of discipline was wrapped in charisma, He didn't yell. He didn't need to. His approval was currency. His disapproval was exile. Players knew the rules, even when unspoken. The Fairview way wasn't just about performance. It was about image. Clean cut, camera ready, legacy minded. That's what he nurtured. That's what sponsors and school boards applauded. Jason didn't fit that. From the moment the transfer student walked into practice, silent, hoodie on, eyes watchful, Danley had written him off. He didn't ask for Jason's stats. He didn't request tape. He assumed this was another kid passing through. Fast, maybe, but unshaped, raw, and not the kind of fast that served the brand. And more importantly, not the kind that came with connections. Danley didn't build stars. He inherited them. That's why Brady worked. A known name, a safe bet. But after the sprint, the one that turned the team silent, something inside Danley calcified. He didn't speak to Jason afterward. He didn't acknowledge the results. In his mind, that race didn't count. Not officially. Not with no timers, no referees. Just adrenaline and luck. That's what he told himself. Over and over. Still, he began watching Jason more closely. Not as a mentor, as a threat. From the bleachers during warm-ups, he tracked Jason's stride with narrowed eyes, making notes in the margins of his clipboard that weren't about form or drills, but about demeanor. Too quiet, doesn't engage, eyes always scanning, runs like he's proving something. Danley didn't say it out loud, but the term he scribbled most often beside the kid's name was unmanageable. In private meetings, he spun the narrative before it could spin him. When athletic directors inquired about the buzz, he chuckled it off, said the kid had raw talent but needed seasoning. To parents, he used softer words like adjustment curve and team cohesion. He knew the script. He'd used it before, and every time, it worked. Because behind every polished phrase was the same belief: certain kinds of athletes needed molding, others needed boundaries. Jason didn't want either, and Danley couldn't control what he couldn't mold. That's when the real game began. It started with subtle adjustments to training schedules, group drills that Jason was accidentally left out of, equipment checks that somehow missed his locker, film reviews where his best sprints were skipped or explained away with phrases like wind advantage or inconsistent pace. To the untrained eye, nothing was wrong. But to someone paying attention, it was sabotage disguised as structure. Still, Jason didn't break. He trained harder, quieter, outran everyone when it mattered. And that, more than anything, infuriated Danley. Because the worse he treated the boy, the more focused he became. The system wasn't bending him. It was sharpening him. Then came the media. Local press had caught wind of the rivalry. Not officially, but through whispers and social media shares. A few bloggers mentioned the transfer phenom, inside articles. A parent-run podcast brought it up in an episode titled Legacy on the Line. Danley hated it. Every new mention chipped away at Brady's dominance. Every post blurred the narrative he'd worked years to build. So he redirected. During interviews, he leaned into the idea of tradition. He spoke of Brady's leadership, used words like consistency, experience, trust. He never criticized Jason publicly. That would draw suspicion. Instead, he praised him just enough to maintain the illusion of fairness, always followed by a reminder of how young he was, how new to the program. But behind the scenes, Danley doubled down. He began meeting with certain boosters, more frequently, having quiet conversations about team image, sponsorship potential, future scholarships. Jason's name never came up directly, but his absence from the discussion was a message all its own. Then, one Friday night, Danley walked into a local bar tucked between a gas station and an abandoned warehouse, a place where alumni whispered bets and rival coaches exchanged gossip. It wasn't part of any official routine. It was off the record, off the books. The bartender knew him. So did the man seated at the back booth. Low profile, eyes sharp, hands steady. A known bookie who handled everything from Friday night games to underground high school basketball pools. Nothing official, nothing traceable, just whispers and wagers. Danley slid into the booth without greeting. The man didn't speak. From his coat pocket, Danley pulled out a folded slip cash inside, rubber banded. $200, clean, quiet. He placed it on the table, and with a smile so slight it could have been mistaken for a twitch, said 5 words that carried more weight than any race he'd ever coached. Put it on Stetson. Easy money, no hesitation, no doubt, just control. Because for Coach Danley, this wasn't about the stopwatch. It was about the system holding. It was about the world staying in the order he recognized, where black kids could be fast, but not faster, where outsiders could impress, but not unseat, where someone like Jason could run, but only within the lines drawn for him. As he left the bar, his phone buzzed with a notification, a new anonymous post from the student forum, a meme of Jason sprinting next to Brady, edited to look like a racehorse beside a luxury car. The caption read, "Speed's cool but class wins." Danley smiled wider this time. The message was spreading. What he didn't know was that someone else had seen him at the bar. A figure in the corner, hooded, nursing a Coke instead of a beer. Quiet. Watching. That figure, a journalism major from the local college, would later pull up the bar's security footage and recognize the envelope, the bet, and the name. And he had just pitched a feature story titled, "The Racist Root of Fairview's Track Dynasty." The inter-school event wasn't supposed to matter. It was billed as a scrimmage, a friendly, non-sanctioned meet with a few regional schools invited. More about community than competition. No medals, no state scouts, no official times that would count toward rankings. Just a warm-up before the real season began. It was the kind of event that coaches used to test lineups and give underclassmen a chance to shake off nerves. For most it was a formality, but for Jason, it was oxygen. The minute he stepped onto the track, shoes laced, breath slow and measured, the whispers started. He wasn't on the official flyer. His name wasn't listed in any printed programs. His heat assignment was only added an hour before the race. In handwriting, not typed. Even his bib looked different. Hand-numbered, smudged at the corners. Yet when he stepped onto the line, the noise fell away. The lane didn't care who printed his name. It only cared who finished first. He crouched into position. The starter raised the pistol. Jason inhaled once. Deeply. Not just air. Everything. The stares. The expectation. The weight. The refusal. The gun cracked. And the world broke open. From the first step, it was clear. Jason didn't just outrun the others. He tore through them. His stride was exact, mechanical in its perfection, but fluid with something else, something no stopwatch could measure. By the halfway mark, the second-place runner was already gasping. Jason didn't glance sideways. He didn't adjust. He didn't surge. He just flew. By the time he crossed the line, there was no photo finish. No need for review. The race was his from the first step. Not a fluke. Not a narrow win. It was domination. And then, silence. No cheers. No applause. Just a stillness that stretched into discomfort. Spectators blinked. Parents shifted in their seats. Students from both schools exchanged uncertain glances. A few clapped, then stopped mid-motion, as if they'd violated some unspoken code. Even the announcer's voice faltered, mispronouncing his name before skipping to the next event. Jason stood there, chest rising, sweat beading on his forehead, waiting, not for praise. He never expected that, but perhaps for acknowledgement, recognition, respect. He found none, not from the officials, who quickly huddled around clipboards pretending to troubleshoot heat placements, not from the other runners, who avoided eye contact and shuffled off like nothing had happened, and definitely not from Coach Danley, who remained seated on the bench, arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes unreadable. Whitman clapped twice. Quiet, controlled. He stood a little straighter, but even he didn't move toward the track. Something was keeping everyone still, and Jason, alone in that victory lane, felt the truth settle deep. He had won, but the win had cost something invisible, yet heavy. As he stepped off the track, walking slowly past the outer lane, the concrete cool beneath his spikes, he felt it, not fear but friction, like the world was resisting his existence in real time. And then he heard the voice, low, calm, almost too soft for the noise around them. A figure in a hoodie stepped in from the outer stands, close enough to brush shoulders as Jason passed. Face obscured, voice steady. "You weren't supposed to win. Not here." Jason turned slightly, but the figure was already gone, swallowed by the crowd. The words echoed louder than any roar. Who was it? A parent? A coach? A rival? The voice didn't carry threat. It carried certainty, like a reminder, not a warning. Like someone reminding him of the script he was supposed to follow. And he had just broken it. The weight of that moment followed him back to the team bench. His teammates said nothing. Brady sat 2 rows behind, arms stretched, gaze fixed somewhere distant, jaw chewing on nothing. Not anger, not panic, just calculation, the kind of cold silence that came before storms. Jason sat alone, breathing steady, gaze forward. But inside, something was cracking. Not from the pressure he could carry that. Not from the stares he'd faced those his whole life. What cracked was the mirror they had forced him to look into. The illusion that performance alone would equal acceptance. That beating them on the track would earn a place beside them off it. He had crossed the line, yes, but he had crossed the wrong one. As he left the event grounds later that evening, a flyer fluttered against his windshield. A photocopy of the race photo with a marker slashed through his face, and a handwritten message, "Win again, and you'll run alone forever." The bus ride back from the meet felt like descending into a vacuum, a heavy quiet thickening the air, until it pressed against the skin. Jason sat alone near the back, the soft vibration of the engine running beneath him. But nothing around him carried the energy of victory. No one celebrated. Not a single voice acknowledged what he had done. It was as if the moment he crossed that finish line, he had walked into a version of Fairview that preferred his failure over its own pride. He watched the back of Brady's head near the front of the bus, his posture rigid, the kind of stillness that wasn't exhaustion but bruised ego. Teammates hovered around him, whispering about irrelevant things, eager to anchor themselves to anything except the truth they'd all seen. The outsider had won, and the wrong person had crossed first. When the bus pulled into the school parking lot, the team spilled out mechanically, each moving quickly toward the entrance, as though proximity to Jason carried some quiet contagion. He followed last, stepping down onto the pavement with a sense of displacement, unsure whether the ground still belonged to him. The silence from the ride clung to them even as they entered the building. No half-hearted nods, no friendly slaps on the shoulder. Fairview High had always been cold toward newness, but this was a specific kind of freeze, one with purpose. The locker room, usually buzzing with post-meet chatter and the hormonal energy of teenage athletes, felt drained, stripped of oxygen. The fluorescent lights hummed a dull, tired tone that only made the absence of sound more painful. Jason walked in and immediately sensed the shift. It wasn't just quiet, it was rejection shaped into atmosphere. No one looked at him, but everyone watched him. Their movements slowed when he stepped inside, as if they feared even the rhythm of their actions might acknowledge him. When he reached his locker, he stopped. His name tag, the small laminated strip that had marked his place among them, had been ripped away. Only a patch of dried, uneven glue remained, surrounded by faint scratches where someone had scraped deliberately at the metal. He stared at it for a long moment, absorbing the clarity of the message. It wasn't an oversight. It wasn't a mistake. This was a deliberate erasure, an unspoken vote, that he didn't belong to the team he had just helped uplift. He scanned the room without turning his head, the way someone learns to do when they've spent years navigating spaces not built for them. A few athletes exchanged glances he wasn't supposed to see. Someone smirked at the floor. Someone else pretended to fix his cleats with exaggerated focus. Their silence was aggressive, more pointed than any insult they could have voiced aloud. On the bench beside him, he found another quiet confirmation. His water bottle was gone, the one he carried everywhere, the one he trained with in the dark when no one else believed he was worth coaching. He sat anyway, forcing calm into his posture, refusing to mirror the hostility around him. His hands moved to unlace his spikes with the same deliberate care he used during late-night training runs. As he bent forward, a teammate brushed past him with a purposeful nudge of the shoulder, light enough to deny, heavy enough to communicate the intent behind it. Across the room, muffled snickers rose and fell like distant thunder. None of it surprised him. None of it hurt as sharply as the truth beneath it. The team didn't want him to lose. They wanted him to vanish. Brady's presence only sharpened the atmosphere. He sat across the row, methodically tying his shoelaces with the poise of someone who believed the world bent in his direction. His eyes flicked up once, locking briefly with Jason's, and in that instant, there was no fury, no embarrassment, no desperation, only calculation. Brady wasn't unraveling outwardly, he was tightening inwardly, rearranging the narrative around himself. In his mind, Jason had not beaten him. Something had simply malfunctioned in the order of things, and order to Brady was always restored eventually. Jason finished unlacing his spikes and stood, slipping into his hoodie. His chest felt tight, but not with defeat. The tightness came from recognition. He wasn't facing individual hostility. He was facing a culture that saw him as a disruption. The school deemed itself progressive. decorated its hallways with banners about integrity and teamwork. But the truth beneath those slogans was unfolding clearly. They liked their success predictable, their champions familiar, and their victories dressed in the faces they recognized as worthy. Jason's existence had bent that frame, and frames didn't bend, they kept. He moved to close his locker, but something inside caught his eye. His sneakers. Not his track spikes. His training shoes. The ones worn from miles of running under dim streetlights. The ones he could barely afford and treated like lifelines. They lay in the back of the locker, torn down the sides, shredded with a kind of precision that spoke more of intention than impulse. The fabric was ripped clean through. The soles dangled by threads. Someone hadn't vandalized them in anger. Someone had destroyed them quietly, intentionally, in silence. Jason didn't touch them. He just stared, and for a moment the entire locker room tightened around him like a fist. Not because the shoes were ruined, he could run barefoot if he had to, but because of what the act represented. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't competition. It was segregation wrapped in athletic culture. A message carved into canvas and rubber that said, "Stay in your lane, just not ours." He felt his heartbeat rise once, then steady. His face didn't change. His hands didn't shake. If they wanted him to collapse, they'd chosen the wrong boy. But just as he reached to shut the locker door, something else caught his eye. A sticky note. Crooked, red ink, placed just beneath the shredded laces, waiting like a final blade. There were only 6 words, but each one sliced deeper than the torn sneakers. "You'll run your mouth before you run again." The handwriting was jagged, rushed, but confident. Someone had written it knowing no one would question them. Someone had placed it knowing the room would stay silent. Someone had expected him to see it and feel small enough to step back. Instead, he stood there motionless, letting the weight of the threat settle around him, not to break him, but to remind him of the battlefield he was standing in the war he hadn't asked for, but could no longer avoid. As he closed the locker, the hallway lights flickered, and a shadow moved past the doorway, someone watching, then disappearing before he could identify them. Fairview had always loved a spectacle. But this time, it wasn't just about the race. It was about the narrative. What had begun as a minor disruption on the track had now ignited something larger, something uglier. Jason's quiet defiance and undeniable talent had moved beyond school walls. Now it was the town that watched him, not with curiosity, but with simmering expectation, the kind that made defeat feel like destiny. Small towns carry long memories and short patience for shifts in their social order. And Jason, whether he wanted to or not, had become the disruption that poked at Fairview's insecurities. He didn't speak much, didn't smile for the crowd, didn't perform the version of black excellence they might have tolerated. He simply ran, and that was enough to make people feel cornered, uneasy. The whispers started in backyards and church meetings. They spread through the cracked screens of Facebook groups, filled with last names that had lived in Fairview for generations. Parents who never attended a single meet suddenly had opinions. Former alumni, miles away and long removed, chimed in like protectors of a legacy that Jason had never asked to threaten. Some comments sounded polite on the surface but were laced with resentment. "He's talented, but is he a team player?" Others were more brazen. "He transferred in just to stir the pot." And some weren't coded at all. "We built this team. Letting him win changes everything." But the worst weren't said aloud. They were shared anonymously, buried in message boards, and private stories that dissolved after 24 hours. Clips of his races were slowed down, edited to add glitch effects, or soundtracked with clown music. Posts predicted his downfall with fake odds and smug captions. Betting lines became a joke among students, and even some adults. Brady was always the favorite. Jason's name was followed by a question mark or a joke emoji. They weren't betting on winners. They were betting on humiliation. The betting pool started in whispers, but it didn't stay hidden for long. At one diner downtown, regulars slid folded papers across the table, marking their picks for the upcoming championship. The waitress took notes like it was routine. Someone even printed flyers with dollar signs above Jason's head, scrawled with phrases like "too fast, too black, too soon." The ink wasn't dry before photos of it hit the internet. Jason saw the posts eventually. Of course he did. He didn't go looking. But you don't have to search for poison in a town that wants you to drink it. Each scroll was a blow. The words weren't new, but the volume was. Before he could pretend it was just his team. Now it was the town. He had gone from ghost to target, from outsider to symbol, from athlete to adversary. Even the support, rare as it was, came with strings. Well-meaning students posting things like, "Let the boy run, y'all," as if he was a trending moment, not a person. In the grocery store, he felt it too. Eyes frozen mid-aisle. The long, lingering glances from people who suddenly remembered they had questions about him. Clerks asked if he needed help when he lingered too long near the cereal aisle. An elderly man in a Letterman jacket muttered something under his breath when Jason passed, something about earning it the right way. He didn't stop walking. He didn't respond. But the sting traveled with him. At school, the weight grew heavier. The jokes got smarter. Cloaked in irony, posted to be funny but meant to wound. Students whispered bets during lunch like fantasy football trades. A TikTok trend even emerged. Mock sprint challenges, with kids running past lockers, collapsing dramatically, tagging it Jason challenge. He didn't respond. He trained. He didn't protest. He ran. But inside it burned. Whitman saw the shift too. The assistant coach had begun cataloging screenshots, noting names, timestamps, conversations overheard. The notebook he had once reopened in secret was now filling fast. What he saw unfolding was no longer subtle. It was a coordinated cultural squeeze, designed not to stop Jason physically, but to corner him emotionally until he either snapped or vanished. And Coach Danley? He said nothing. He neither condemned nor participated publicly, but his silence screamed. He adjusted training schedules so Jason's drills were solo. He dismissed valid complaints about vandalized gear as teenage drama. He refused to submit Jason's sprint times for district recognition, claiming clerical oversight. Each choice was tactical, each omission a decision. Jason understood now. The race wasn't on the track. It was everywhere else. Then came the twist no one expected. A fake flyer began circulating across every major student social platform. Slickly designed, almost professional. Jason's face centered in high contrast, overlaid with bold red letters. "Catch the fall. December." It looked like a concert poster, but the message was chilling. The date was real. The day of the district meet. The hour, exact. But the phrase "catch the fall" wasn't hype. It was hunger. They were predicting collapse. Hoping for it. Advertising it. The post spread fast. Not just among students. Adults, local influencers, even rival school fans reposted it under the guise of jokes. But the intent was obvious. It wasn't just mockery. It was prophecy. They wanted to see the black boy who ran too fast, too clean, too confidently fall. And worse, they wanted to watch. That night, Jason opened his locker to find a laminated version of the flyer folded inside his jacket, circled in red with a new phrase scribbled across the bottom: "We'll be front row." The air carried a different weight on race day. Not just wind, but electricity. A pressure that pulsed through the stadium like something was waiting to explode. By noon, the bleachers were full. By 1 p.m., they were overflowing. This wasn't just another district meet. It had become a spectacle. A cultural referendum disguised as sport. Local officials lined the fence with VIP lanyards and coffee in hand. Camera crews positioned their tripods like rifles, angles calibrated for drama. Parents held homemade signs. Students snapped selfies. And the energy was laced with anticipation that had little to do with athletics. Everyone had come not just to watch a race, but to witness a verdict. The story had already been written in whispers and headlines. Brady Stetson, Fairview's golden son, defending the crown. Jason Carter, the outsider, the troublemaker, the fast black boy who disrupted everything by daring to run as if he belonged. And now, the crowd wasn't just watching. They were betting on what they wanted to believe. That tradition would hold. The athletes gathered near the track in tight clusters, stretching, joking, focusing. But wherever Jason moved, silence followed. The tension in the air wasn't just athletic. It was racial, social, institutional. Every step he took was shadowed by a dozen conversations no one was bold enough to say out loud. He passed the team tent without looking up, feeling the glances dig into his back like needles. His name hadn't been mentioned in the team huddle. His uniform hadn't been included in the pre-race photo. He wasn't just running without a lane. He was running without a team. Whitman stood nearby, arms crossed, watching everything. His clipboard hung loosely in one hand, but he didn't check it. His attention stayed locked on Jason, like someone who understood the cost of history repeating itself. Whitman had been here before, not literally, but spiritually. He'd felt this particular silence years ago, in his own spikes, on a different track where the outcome didn't matter, unless it aligned with their comfort. He said nothing, but his stillness spoke volume. Meanwhile, Coach Danley paced near the fence, greeting donors and alumni, all smiles and nods. His charm was fully activated. His voice elevated just enough to be overheard, praising Brady's leadership and composure. Not once did he mention the other runner. To him, Jason wasn't a threat. He was an error, one that would correct itself when the gun fired. The stadium announcer's voice boomed overhead, rattling through the sound system as the schedule ticked forward. The 100-melee dash, the 200-melee heats, the relays. Each race moved the crowd closer to the one moment they were all waiting for. The 400-meter final. Jason stood at the edge of the warm-up area, legs pulsing with quiet energy. His breathing was steady, not from calm, but control. He had rehearsed this 1,000 times, in his backyard, on cracked sidewalks, on empty streets where no one cared how fast he moved. But this moment wasn't just about a finish line. It was about visibility, legacy, and the cost of not shrinking. Brady arrived 10 minutes before the final, late by design. His uniform crisp, his stride casual, his body language loose. He walked like someone entering a parade, not a race. When he passed Jason, their shoulders almost brushed, but not quite. The crowd around them shifted, pretending to fix equipment, tie shoes, adjust watches, all excuses to stare without seeming obvious. The announcer began calling the lane assignments. Jason, Lane 5, Brady, Lane 4, directly beside each other. A deliberate decision. Jason rolled out his shoulders, bent low, touched the track with his fingers. The surface felt firmer than usual, warmer, as if it were alive. His sneakers, newer but still unfamiliar, gripped the rubber like they knew what was coming. Then he saw it. Across the field, near the edge of the official's tent, Coach Danley was speaking to the head referee. Quiet, close, too close. Jason watched the coach's mouth move, not animated, not instructional, but measured, purposeful. The kind of conversation that didn't belong to logistics, but persuasion. The referee didn't interrupt. He just listened, then nodded once, slowly. Jason's stomach tightened, but his face stayed still. His muscles didn't flinch. If they were altering something, rules, starting procedures, even lane inspection protocols, he couldn't prove it, but he could feel it, the same way he felt when he entered a room, and eyes refused to meet his. That deep gnawing sense that someone had already decided what kind of ending you deserved. He stood upright again, breath held for 1 second longer than needed. Across the lane, Brady did a quick hop, rolled his neck, cracked his knuckles with dramatic flair. His jaw was set, his smile faint. They were both ready, but only one of them had earned his lane without help. As Jason stepped into his lane and lowered into position, a sharp buzz cut through the air. A last-minute technical delay announced over the speaker. But on the scoreboard screen above the field, a new name appeared at the bottom. A replacement runner had been added to lane 6, one no one had seen warming up, and Jason recognized him instantly. It was the boy who'd whispered to him after the last race. "You weren't supposed to win." The starting line didn't just divide the lanes. It split the world. Brady stood in lane 4, his frame steady, wrapped in a state-issued uniform tailored for him months ago. His spikes gleamed, pristine and branded, gifted by a regional sponsor that had supported Fairview's legacy athletes for years. His warm-up jacket bore the embroidered initials of an elite training facility miles away, one he'd visited during summer while others scraped together workouts in public parks. Around him, whispers turned to applause. Parents clapped as if watching royalty enter an arena. Camera flashes popped like confetti. In lane 5, Jason stood alone. No sponsor logos. No cheers. His uniform wasn't new. It was issued late, after the first order didn't have his size. His shoes were replacements, laced tight, but still stiff in places that hadn't yet molded to his form. There was no crowd behind him, no familiar face leaning over the rail with encouragement. Just space, and silence. The contrast was cinematic and deliberate. Jason knew this wasn't just a race. It was a performance for an audience that had already chosen its favorite act. But if they expected him to shrink under the weight of their silence, they hadn't been paying attention. The applause behind Brady was noise. What Jason carried in his chest was thunder. The runners to his right gave him quick glances, half curious, half wary. But the one in lane 6, the late edition, he didn't look at Jason at all. He just adjusted his blocks and stared straight ahead, face expressionless beneath a hood that barely passed regulation. Jason recognized the stance, the energy, the stillness sharpened by something beyond sport. It wasn't rivalry. It was role-playing. This runner had been placed beside him for a reason, one not written on any heat sheet. The memory struck hard. The same figure in the hoodie, after the inter-school race. The one who had whispered, "You weren't supposed to win, not here," and now here he was, shoulder to shoulder, at the most pivotal race of the season, entered last minute, cleared with a nod, warmed up in silence. Coach Danley stood across the field, arms folded, lips tight, watching without blinking. Brady hadn't acknowledged the new addition, but his posture had changed slightly more upright, more relaxed, as if assured that an extra hand had been added to tilt the balance back in his favor. The stadium announcer introduced the lineup. Brady's name drew a wave of cheers. His achievements were listed in full: 3-time district champ, undefeated in home meets, national qualifier. When Jason's name was spoken, it came with only a number: Lane 5, Jason Carter, Fairview High. No mention of his fastest time. No recognition of his performance record. Just a name dropped like an afterthought. Jason stepped into position. His fingers brushed the rubber of the track, familiar now despite everything. His back curved, steady and sharp. His focus narrowed. This wasn't just about who crossed first. It was about proving something that couldn't be timed. Across the track, students leaned forward, phones lifted. Some weren't even filming the race. They were filming him waiting for the moment he stumbled, betting on the edit. On failure. Some had already written captions in their heads. Jason closed his eyes, not to escape, to remember. The nights on cracked sidewalks. The shoes duct-taped at the toe. The note in his locker. The word quit sprayed across his front door. The shredded sneakers. The silence from teachers. The smirk from Coach Danley. The fake flyer promising his fall. The pain behind his aunt's eyes when she scrubbed the front steps clean while pretending everything was fine. Every insult became breath. Every rejection became rhythm. Every doubt became fuel. Then movement. The official raised his arm. The crowd hushed. A visible ripple of anticipation rolled across the bleachers, like a storm forming in slow motion. Jason glanced to his left. Brady didn't flinch. He exhaled casually and leaned into his stance. His smirk faint but firm. To his right, the late entrant in lane 6 adjusted his heel plate, then rolled his neck once with almost choreographed control. Still no glance. Still no acknowledgement. Jason dug his fingers into the track. One last inhale. The referee raised the pistol. The stadium leaned forward. And then from the bleachers, just above the finish line, a voice ripped through the silence, high-pitched and unmistakable. "Trip him." A gasp surged through the crowd. The referee froze. Jason's body stayed low, muscles coiled tight, heart hammering not from nerves but from the knowledge that this moment had just shifted again. Not because of the voice, but because of the reaction. Some in the crowd laughed. Others didn't move at all. As the referee lowered the pistol slightly to scan the crowd, Jason saw something flicker in the corner of his eye. Lane 6's runner shifting forward, just enough to test boundaries before the start. Not to run, but to reach. Time didn't start with the gun. It started with the shift. The moment Lane 6's runner edged forward, not far enough to draw a penalty, just enough to disrupt concentration, just enough to remind Jason that even at the edge of fairness, hands were still reaching to control him. The crowd buzzed with a shallow, uneasy laugh. The referee hesitated. Then, without warning, the pistol cracked through the air. The runners launched. For a fraction of a second, everything disappeared. Noise, pressure, memory. Jason's body didn't respond to fear. It responded to rhythm, to muscle memory built through months of unseen labor. His feet gripped the track like he had waited his entire life for this one line to open beneath him. Brady surged ahead first. His form was clean, almost arrogant, in its perfection. It was the kind of speed polished by years of praise. The kind of confidence that comes from never needing to fight for space. Jason was a step behind. Not because he lacked the ability, but because he had to calculate everything differently. He didn't just run the race. He had to read it, measure it, trust no one. The first 100 meters blurred. Every heartbeat sounded like thunder between his ears. The track shifted beneath him, the friction sharp and unforgiving. Lane 6's runner matched his pace to the decimal, keeping even with him, not racing to win but racing to contain. Every movement from that side was invasive, almost choreographed to distract, not illegal, just close enough to make Jason run with half an eye open. At 200 meters, the curve hit hard. This was where races changed, where sprinters lost control and runners became strategists. Brady maintained his lead, his posture tall, arms cutting clean through the air. The cheers behind him swelled, swelling the lane with validation. Jason felt the wind pull at his body as he leaned into the curve, tightening his core, lungs beginning to rebel against the oxygen debt piling inside him. It wasn't pain he felt. It was expectation stacked, sharp, and deliberate. Every face in the stands became another voice in his head. The flyer from the locker, the whispers in the hallway, the laughter on the bus, the clipboard Coach Danley refused to write his name on. All of it looped behind his eyes in flashes. But he didn't blink. At 250 he adjusted. Not outwardly. Internally. His breath shortened. His stride lowered. He shifted from surviving the race to taking control of it. Brady was still ahead. But only just. The crowd noise twisted. Unsure now, as if even the air had started to question its bias. Jason could feel lane 6 begin to fade. Not in speed, but in intent. The runner had lost rhythm, no longer running for time, but for obstruction. Every few strides his elbow drifted just wide enough to force Jason tighter into the curve. Jason responded not with panic but with precision. He used the inside of his stride, letting his hips rotate more freely, closing the gap from a slant. Every inch was earned like it cost something. His calves burned, ankles felt like glass, but he kept the pressure even. Not reckless, tactical. By 300 meters the shift was undeniable. Brady's form stiffened. His chin lifted just slightly, exposing a crack that no one in Fairview had seen in 3 years. His arms pumped harder, not cleaner. His feet scraped the track with a new kind of desperation. Jason surged. Not with flair. With finality. His body pushed by every insult ever swallowed. Every door ever closed. Moved with the power of silence, turned kinetic. He pulled even with Brady in 6 steps. The stadium went dead quiet. No one expected to see this image. The golden boy and the ghost, running shoulder to shoulder. It didn't compute. It didn't fit the narrative. Parents froze mid-cheer. Students forgot their phones. Even the announcer paused. Jason didn't see the crowd. He saw the finish line, and he saw Brady glance sideways. The moment happened in the breath before 350 meters. That half-second of disbelief. The moment when dominance realizes it's no longer alone. Brady's eyes flicked to the left, panic folding into the corners of his expression. Jason pushed harder. His legs screamed. His spine lit up with fire. Every muscle strained against its limit. The track blurred beneath him, and for the first time in the entire season, he knew fully, without doubt, that he wasn't running for validation. He was running to break something bigger than a record. He leaned in, half a step ahead now. The finish line stretched 30 meters ahead. The only sound he could hear was the ragged churn of his own breath, and Brady's feet trying to catch a rhythm they no longer owned. And then Brady's elbow rose. Subtle, controlled, just enough. Not a punch, not a strike, a nudge, a movement that could be explained as accidental. As he lost half a step, Brady let the inside of his arm drift out, just as Jason passed too close. The contact was sharp, not enough to trip, but enough to jolt. Jason's foot clipped slightly. His balance shifted. His form faltered for one heartbeat. One blink of a moment. The crowd gasped, but still didn't speak. Jason didn't fall. He absorbed the motion, bent lower, and powered through the contact with a growl buried deep in his chest. He didn't look back. He didn't retaliate. He just ran. And just before the finish line, as the ribbon blurred into sight, a figure stepped into the track's edge, camera raised, not to capture the win, but to intercept the moment. The final meters stretched out beneath Jason's feet, like a gauntlet, rubberized lanes guiding him toward a finish line that had transformed from a simple stripe into a threshold loaded with history, expectations, fear, and hope. Each heartbeat thundered in his ears, filling his skull with static, drowning out cheers, doubts, distance. The entire stadium had vanished from his consciousness. There was only the lane, the empty air ahead, the ghost of every step he had ever taken. His lungs burned with the weight of every insult, every erased nameplate, every shredded shoe, every mocking post, every silent locker room. But the pain was distant now, background noise to the storm of motion. Every muscle screamed in protest. His calves felt like coal burning from the inside, thighs ragged with effort, spine taut with need. Still he edged forward, gliding beyond limits that had always been drawn for him, limits he was determined to shatter. Beside him, his competitor, the one added last minute, the shadow runner from lane 6, kept pace like a mirror with malicious intent. The strides matched his, breath synchronized to mimic, elbows hovering just wide enough to threaten, enough to unsettle. The undercurrent was clear. This race was never meant to be fair. It was meant to be a message. Run, but only where we allow you. Brady had fallen behind, his earlier lead cracking under pressure. But the fabric of legacy doesn't unravel on clean losses. Legacy fights dirty. As the three of them thundered toward the tape, the stands went silent. No cheers, no shout. A hush so complete it felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for either redemption or ruin. Then the collision. It wasn't a crash, but a violent blur. Limbs entwined, bodies airborne for a fraction of a second, weightless in a sky of anticipation. Time slowed. You could almost hear the heartbeat of the universe skipping. For a moment the runners weren't running, they were suspended. Two figures hurtling toward an uncertain fate. A canvas streaked with sweat, fear and possibility. When gravity took them back, the impact cracked through the air like thunder. Rubber snapped, knees buckled, and one body collapsed. The world exhaled in a gasp of shock, a collective pulse of disbelief. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Jason lay where he fell, chest heaving, vision blurred, every sense screaming that something was wrong. Pain bloomed across his limbs, but even that was drowned by the roaring silence, the kind that follows something terrible and undeniable. The official dashed onto the track, whistle raised, both arms wide as if ready to catch broken bones. The crowd in the stands sat frozen, many clutching phones they hadn't raised yet. Then movement. The announcer's voice cracked over the PA system, but not with excitement. Confusion. The word incident echoed down the lanes, impersonal, clinical. Cameras pivoted, focus shifting from finish line to fallen runner. Flash bulbs popped. But they didn't capture victory. They captured a question. Because when the dust finally settled, when the echoes faded, and the world exhaled, the gasps weren't for who was standing. They were for what he held. In Jason's hand, curled tight against his chest, was something small and metallic. A stopwatch. The same one used by the head coach at every meet. The one that measured every time, every split, every dream that aligned with the program's standard. It wasn't his. It never had been. But it was there now, clutched like a weapon. The stadium's air rippled with shock. Faces blanched, as people realized what it meant. That stopwatch, with its pristine plastic shell and cracked screen, held numbers, times unedited, unfiltered, undeniable. Times that belonged to the race they tried to script. Times they tried to erase. A sudden murmur began somewhere, low at first, then swelling. Questions, doubts, whispers. What happened? How? Why did he have it? Who had given it to him? Who had let him run it for real? Coach Donnelly froze at the edge of the track, eyes wide, clipboard dropping from his hand. The world shifted beneath him for the first time in decades. His program, his legacy, everything he built on control, unraveling in a single breath. The runner from lane 6 lay a few meters away, motionless. Officials gathered around him, protective in their posture, but their focus wouldn't stay there long, because all eyes had turned to Jason, to the stopwatch. For the first time, the crowd wasn't just waiting for someone to win. They were waiting for someone to answer. A hush fell over the stadium, as a single spotlight, one of the broadcast cameras, zoomed in. The screen flickered. Then, in bold letters across the jumbotron over the stands, 3 words appeared. Rerun request. The stadium lights cut bright lines across sweat-slick skin, but the glare of victory had lost its warmth. When the scoreboard blinked out rerun request, the crowd exhaled, but not with relief. With confusion. Disbelief. The hush that had settled as cameras zoomed in on the stopwatch in Jason's hand lingered longer than any cheer. There was no roar, no applause. Instead, an uneasy echo of murmurs that spread outward like poison through the stands. He stood frozen at the finish line, chest rising, lungs heaving, the residual burn of his sprint refusing to fade. All around, people lowered their phones, hesitated. Someone whispered into a headset. The track that had felt like justice only seconds ago was now a courtroom of doubt. The race was being challenged. The validity of the result questioned. Not because of speed, because of the narrative. Within minutes, chaos stirred. News crews flooded the stadium grounds. their microphones and cameras hungry for a version of the story that matched the comfort zones of their viewers. Reporters pressed into the empty lane where Brady had once run, measuring the turf, scanning the rubber strips with a neutral detachment that disguised accusation. Technical review, they called it. Official inquiry. For them, the stopwatch in Jasion's hand didn't guarantee truth. It opened debate. As he walked off the track under the harsh floodlights, his spikes dangling from his fingers, the tension in the air shifted. Admiration receded. Suspicion advanced. He had done what the system said couldn't be done, but the system refused to absorb that possibility without compromise. Outside the stadium, the digital world erupted. Screens lit up with headlines. Controversial finish. Fairview race under scrutiny. Did the outsider get help? Track dynasty or trial by stopwatch. Social media ignited in seconds. Anonymous accounts circulated. Edited clips of the last meters. Freeze frames of the elbow. Speculation that the stopwatch had been tampered. That the fall had been staged for sympathy votes. That the rerun was evidence of too much pressure from the media. Some posts were concerned. Others outright hostile. Messages to Jasion's personal social handles, now public property, demanded explanations. Threats, accusations, racist undertones buried under feigned sportsmanship. Outside Fairview, notebooks full of betting lines had assumed collapse was certain. They were suddenly angry at a race that refused collapse. Back in the school's administration buildings, the halls buzzed with drafts of official statements. Parents demanded integrity. Donors threatened sponsorship withdrawals. Alumni flooded voicemail lines, calling for reassurance that tradition would be preserved. The team locker room, once a chamber of silent hostility, emptied quickly. Coaches avoided eye contact. Staff wore the nervous energy of people waiting for a verdict they hoped would protect them. But amidst the disarray, one silence stood out most clearly. Coach Danley. He didn't appear for interviews. He didn't post statements. He vanished. His office door remained closed. His name unspoken. In a world where victory earned fame, disappearance screamed guilt. Whitman watched all of it from the sidelines. He had foreseen the backlash, but not necessarily the intensity. He had quietly taken photos of the stopwatch, saved the original file before tweets and shares scrambled its metadata, kept the press pass applications the anonymous blogger had submitted, logged timestamps of suspicious posts, started an archive file on his old laptop. He realized that what began as a fight for a fair run had become a fight for truth, and truth, once exposed to fire, either hardened or shattered. He didn't know which it would be, but he knew he had to stand with it. Meanwhile, in Jason's home, the night swallowed the normalcy of after-race celebration. There was no cheering when he walked in. Instead, there were quiet footsteps at the door, soft clicks of locks, and the cautious turning of lights. His aunt sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold. Her eyes were red, distant, not from joy but fear. She had seen what support looked like on screens, real-time messages, threatening reputational ruin, racial slurs masquerading as debate, side-by-side comparisons of Brady's legacy and his intrusion. When she looked at Jason, she didn't see the kid who ran too fast. She saw the target, the kid who had forced Fairview to look at itself. Jason didn't speak. He didn't raise his shoulders. He didn't light up the victory with grateful smiles. Instead, he sat at the edge of the chair, fingers tapping the stopwatch. He felt its weight against his palm. Cold plastic, harsh digits, certainty, a tool of measurement that refused to blink. It was his proof. But outside, proof was no longer evidence. It was ammunition, a challenge to the comfortable truths that others relied on. Across town, in a small newsroom cluttered with coffee-stained desks and worn-out chairs, a young sports journalist named Marisol leaned forward, her eyes scanning archived records of track meets, year after year, names and times catalogued, patterns drawn not just from wins, but omission. She had been tipped off by an anonymous email, pointing to discrepancies, times never submitted, record wins mysteriously voided, external qualifiers erased at final submission, sprinters disqualified on technicalities that never applied to others. The email included redacted PDFs, pixelated screenshots, and a broken stopwatch identical in model to the one Jason held. Marisol's heart pounded as she pieced it together. Meet after meet, school after school, race after race. A pattern emerged: talented outsiders, usually black or brown, edging ahead of legacy runners, then disqualified, ignored, erased. She leaned back in her chair, the overhead lamp flickering. Her fingers hovered over the keys, ready to draft a headline, that could shake more than a school's reputation. But deeper than shock, a question settled. What had been hidden behind every trophy cabinet, every record board, every sponsored jersey? What stories had been buried to maintain the illusion of supremacy? Her cursor hovered, refusing to type. Because this wasn't just a story about a race. It was bigger than that. It was a legacy of control, of exclusion, of silence enforced by privilege. At that moment, as cameras outside Jason's house flashed through darkness and the world argued over a stopwatch, real accountability began to form. The digital files, the forbidden clips, the prescription for erasure, all pointed to one man. A man whose name had become a brand. A man whose career had thrived on legacy. A man whose empire could collapse with a single published article. Jason sensed the shift. He didn't know where it would take him. A renewed race at best, a public investigation at worst. But under the weight of doubt, something else flickered. Hope. The kind that comes not from validation, but from exposure, from seeing your truth laid bare under lights too bright to avoid. He lifted the stopwatch again, staring at the digits fading on the screen. This time, he wasn't preparing to run for them. He was preparing to run for more, for justice, for accountability, for every erased record, for every silent locker, for every painted door, for every shred of identity torn from the soles of worn-out sneakers. He ran not just for speed, but for truth. As dawn broke the next morning, Marisol's article went live, titled 15 Years of Silence, How One Coach Controlled the Finish Line. Instant alerts turned her small newsroom upside down. But when she clicked publish, the monitor flickered, and a new message popped up on her screen. You don't know how deep this goes. If this story moved you, if you've ever seen talent dismissed because of skin color or heard silence where justice should speak, don't scroll past. Type yes in the comments if you believe every young person deserves a fair start, no matter their race. What would you have done if you were in Jason's shoes? Subscribe for more untold truths, because the fight for justice doesn't end at the finish line.